Hey guys, tonight we're venturing into a world long forgotten by comfort, but rich in resilience. Imagine a time when survival wasn't just a struggle, it was a nightly ritual of endurance. Tonight, we explore the lives of those who lived through some of the most bitter winters in human history, not with the luxury of central heating or wool-lined boots, but with wit, willpower, and a sense of communal survival. The people we're talking about weren't warriors or nobles. They were the peasants of the medieval world. Ordinary souls who faced extraordinary hardship, night after night, with little more than fire, faith, and layers of mud and straw between them and the cold. So before you settle in under your warm blanket, maybe turn the lights low and let the soft hum of a fan carry you back in time. We're not here to judge history. We're here to listen to it breathe, whisper, and howl like the wind through the cracks of an old thatched roof. Now imagine this. The year is lost to history, but the season is unmistakable. Winter. Not a quaint snow globe winter, but one that bites like a wolf and lingers like sorrow. You live in a crude shelter, the walls made of sticks interlaced with clumps of mud and cow dung. It sounds unpleasant, and it was, but it was also clever. The mixture called wattle and daub was the medieval answer to insulation. If you want to call it that, it kept out the worst of the wind, just not all of it. At night, as the sun disappears and the frost claims everything outside, the temperature inside dips perilously close to matching it. You wrap yourself in everything you own, which is probably a few coarse layers of wool, stiff from wear and heavy with the stink of smoke and animal oil. There is no chimney in your home. The fire, your only source of warmth, burns low in the center of the room, and its smoke climbs lazily upward until it finds a crack in the roof or simply decides to loiter in the rafters. Breathing in your own home feels like walking through a fog made of embers. Your eyes water, your throat itches. But still, you're warm, at least warmer than outside. Your bed isn't a bed, it's a pile of straw on the floor, or if you're lucky, on a wooden frame. The straw's itchy, damp from the ground, and undoubtedly home to a few fleas who seem to enjoy the winter just fine. You try not to think about them. You lie down anyway, pressing your back against the coarse stuffing, and tuck your feet under whatever sackcloth or sheepskin you've got. You're not looking for comfort. You're just trying to stay alive. The cold, though, it finds you. It creeps in through the earthen floor, climbs up your spine like a ghost with icy fingers. No part of the house is sealed. No wall is truly solid. The wind doesn't knock on your door. It moves straight through the gaps beside it. And when it blows, it's not just a breeze. It's a force of nature, alive and shrieking like some ancient spirit. Your fire sputters in protest. You pull your cloak tighter, curl your limbs closer, and listen to the symphony of a winter night in the Middle Ages. Everyone huddles together. Children sleep pressed between adults. The elderly are buried beneath layers of cloth and arms. Sometimes animals are brought in too. A goat curled near the hearth, a pig rooting for a dry corner. It wasn't just about company. Their body heat mattered, every extra degree counted, and in those freezing nights, even a snoring cow was a welcome source of warmth. You may not sleep. Not really. You may drift in and out, waking each time someone shifts or the wind howls just right. But if you wake in the morning and your breath still clouds the air, if your fingers still move and your eyes blink open, then you've made it. You've beaten the night, and you'll do it again. Because you have to. No one waits for spring in a medieval village. You endure until it arrives. To the outsider, it all seems brutal, maybe even impossible. But for those who lived it, it was simply life. They didn't expect ease. They didn't dream of luxury. They patched holes with moss, layered wool over linen, and whispered prayers into the darkness. They weren't weak. They were inventive. And in the quiet heroism of their daily survival, they carved out a kind of existence that, though harsh, was astonishingly human. The wind never truly left their homes. It slithered through the smallest cracks, curled under the doors, and teased at every corner, making even silence feel cold. A medieval peasant's house was less a barrier against the elements and more a suggestion of shelter. It stood because it had to, but it trembled under the weight of every storm. Most homes were a single room shared by the entire family. There were no hallways, no bedrooms, no doors to close. Privacy was a luxury no one expected, and warmth was a shared effort. The walls were made of whatever could be found nearby, bundled sticks plastered over with mud and straw and held together with dung. It wasn't about aesthetics. It was survival on a shoestring. Dung, unpleasant as it sounds, was excellent at plugging gaps and holding heat. It was sticky, available, and, once dry, nearly scentless. Nearly. Roofs were made of thatch, layers of dry straw stacked and tied together. In theory, they were rainproof. In practice, they sagged, they leaked, and they played host to a thriving ecosystem of insects, birds, and small mammals. Now and then, a squirrel or a rat might fall in mid-meal, crashing onto your table or into your sleeping space. You cursed, shooed it away, and kept eating. Life moved on. Windows, if present, were mere slits in the wall. No glass. Just an opening covered in a hide stretched tight or a wooden shutter. The purpose was simple. Let in a bit of light and try not to freeze the room entirely. During winter, these shutters were closed tightly, leaving the room dim, smoky, and dense with the smell of life lived in close quarters. And then, the floor, if you could call it that. No wooden planks or stone tiles. Just earth, trampled and hardened by years of footsteps. When it rained, the water rose from beneath, turning the interior into a kind of shallow, frozen swamp. Straw was thrown down to absorb the moisture, but it never dried. The scent of dampness clung to everything. You walked across your own floor and felt the mud seep up through your soles, through your cloth-wrapped feet, into your bones. Still, they endured. They found clever ways to fight back. Gaps in the wall were packed with moss, rags, even hair if necessary. Anything soft, anything insulating. People became builders by instinct. You didn't study engineering. You stuffed whatever you had into the cold and hoped it held until morning. In the dead of winter, someone might even go outside with a bucket of fresh mud and smear another layer over the outside walls, hands trembling from the chill, muttering that this would be the last time. But it never was. Even with all this effort, the house could never truly hold warmth. The fire at the center of the room, the hearth, was everything. It was your heat source, your stove, your light, your heart. It burned wood when you had it, peat when you didn't, and dried animal dung when you had no choice. The fire never roared. It flickered, smoldered, and choked out more smoke than flame. But it was enough. Enough to survive, enough to live another day. Smoke had no clear path to escape. Chimneys were rare, even among the better-off peasants. The smoke drifted upwards until it found a hole or a crack in the ceiling. Most of the time, it didn't find one. It just stayed. Coated the rafters, stung your eyes, burned your lungs. But that same smoke drove away fleas. It killed off mites and lice. In a way, it was your ally. As night fell, the battle began again. Every ember was precious. You didn't let the fire die, not if you could help it. Reigniting it in the morning was no simple task. You had to strike flint against steel, catch a spark in a bundle of dry moss or a lint, and breathe life into it like coaxing a heartbeat from a dying body. If the fire died in the night, your chances of waking up diminished drastically. So you banked it, covered it with ash to keep it smoldering until dawn. If you did it right, you could uncover it in the morning, add kindling, and start anew. If you did it wrong, you'd wake to cold ashes and colder air. They lived like this, night after night, winter after winter. They didn't expect comfort, they expected to suffer. But within that suffering, they discovered resilience, an unspoken agreement with the world that they would not go quietly, not without a fight. And that fight, though unseen by history books, was epic in its own way. No poems were written about them, no songs sung, but their strength echoed in every fire they kept alive. Every child they wrapped in wool, every frozen morning they greeted not with despair, but with motion, feeding animals, tending embers, and repairing what the wind had broken the night before. When the frost claimed the earth and the night stretched long, medieval peasants didn't rely on single acts of survival. They layered strategies like clothing, each one built atop the last. They knew the cold wasn't just a nuisance, it was a predator. And the only defense was vigilance, creativity, and an unyielding will to outlast it. One of the cruelest truths they faced was this: the cold didn't always come from the sky or the wind. It seeped up from the ground. The very floor beneath them betrayed warmth. It radiated cold like a slow poison creeping into their bones as they slept. The floors were dirt, just the hardened earth, tamped down over generations. No padding, no stonework, no insulation. If you were lucky, someone had tossed some straw or dried rushes over it, enough to dull the chill, but never enough to block it. The straw flattened with use. The rushes broke down. No one cleared them out. They simply laid more on top, a layering of decay, slowly turning into compost beneath their feet. It created what could generously be called a medieval carpet, lumpy, musty, full of life that you'd rather not think about. Insects made their homes in the layers. Fleas thrived. The smell was unique, somewhere between wet grass and old goats. But no one complained. Complaining didn't warm you. Acceptance did. The bedding was no better. A wooden frame, if you could afford one, held a large cloth sack filled with straw or hay. Some didn't even have that. Just straw piled directly on the floor. Every night you laid yourself down onto a prickly, rustling, vaguely moldy bed and pulled whatever you could over yourself. Blankets were rare. Most peasants made do with cloaks, old garments, and animal skins, patched and repurposed until the original cloth could no longer be seen. You didn't sleep soundly. The cold ensured that. You'd roll from side to side, not out of restlessness, but out of necessity. To keep blood flowing, to keep limbs from stiffening. You curled in on yourself, knees tucked tight, shoulders hunched. Every breath created a mist that hovered briefly before vanishing into the gloom. And when you awoke, assuming you did, your joints ached, your skin stung, but you were still here. That was enough. But it wasn't just about straw, or cloaks, or prayer. The fire was central. If there was a single line between life and death in a peasant's home, it was the hearth. A simple fire pit in the middle of the room, ringed with stones, blackened by years of smoke. There was no chimney to carry the smoke skyward. It hung in the air like a curtain, thick and biting. But that smoke did more than suffocate. It was a weapon. It warded off insects. It purified in a rough, choking way. And most importantly, it warmed. Everyone in the house had a role in keeping it alive. Children were taught to tend the embers before they could even speak clearly. Grandparents, stiff from age and frozen joints, took long night shifts, watching the coals like sacred flames. A fire wasn't allowed to die. Letting it go out was more than a mistake. It was an invitation to death. So they banked the fire each night, burying the glowing embers under layers of ash, like tucking in a sleeping child. Done properly, the embers would last until morning, ready to be stirred and fed. Done poorly, and you'd wake to a dead hearth and a home colder than the outside. There was art to it. Each family had its method. Some claimed dry ash worked best. Others swore by a slight dampness. Some believed in packing the embers tight, while others left room for breath. It was part tradition, part ritual, part science, learned over generations, shared in whispers beside the flames. Yet even the best-prepared fire couldn't always win. Sometimes the wind found its way in and stole the warmth. Sometimes a sheep or dog, wandering too close in the night, kicked over a coal or knocked apart the bank dash. It wasn't rare for someone to wake in the cold dark, stir the ashes, and find only silence. Then the long, dreadful task of rekindling began, with frozen hands and breath that came in short, painful bursts. But there was another defense against the cold, older than fire, older than tools. It was each other. On the coldest nights, families didn't sleep separately. They gathered, body to body, pressed close under the lowest beams of the house, limbs tangled, warmth shared like a communal treasure. Children nestled between adults. The elderly were tucked into the center like fragile coals. If livestock was inside, and it often was, they joined too. A pig by your feet, a goat near your shoulder, a chicken perched on a nearby stool. There was no shame in it. Warmth was warmth. Breathing together meant surviving together. It didn't matter if someone smelled like old onions or goat hair. The alternative was unthinkable. In those moments, there was no personal space, no privacy, just the raw human need to share heat. This wasn't simply practicality. Over time, it became a form of comfort. Huddled under shared cloaks, wrapped in layers of cloth, families whispered stories, recited prayers, or simply lay still, listening to the wind rage outside. You could feel your neighbor's breath on your cheek, your sibling's toes against your knees, the low grunt of a nearby animal, all reminders that you were not alone, that together you might see the dawn. If you stepped into a medieval peasant's home during the dead of winter, you might be startled, not just by the cold or the scent or the heavy air filled with smoke, but by the unexpected roommates, not guests, not visitors, residents, chickens, goats, pigs, even cows, all packed inside the same single-room space as the family. And not out of whimsy or affection, but out of absolute necessity. The idea wasn't to create a barnyard opera inside your living quarters. It was about warmth. Living creatures give off heat, and in a world where every degree mattered, that warmth became a form of currency. A cow resting against the wall could mean the difference between frostbitten limbs and a tolerable night. A pig curled near the hearth might be the only thing keeping your toes from turning numb. This wasn't unusual. It was the norm. At nightfall, animals were led inside, guided gently or dragged, depending on their mood, and settled into corners beneath lofts beside sleeping mats. Chickens nested in baskets, goats stood where they pleased, and pigs sprawled out with an attitude of entitlement that suggested they knew exactly how important they were. The house transformed into a noisy, shifting, snorting furnace. A living machine of shared survival, and with that survival came a price. The smell alone was legendary. Imagine wet hay, wood smoke, sweat, unwashed wool, and the constant hum of animals that neither bathed nor cared about your comfort. But people learned to ignore it. You had to. Their noses adapted, or perhaps surrendered, and the stench became background noise, part of the winter landscape like the wind or the distant barking of hungry dogs. Cows, being large and warm, got the best spots. Often near the family, often against the walls, they lounged like royalty, lazily chewing cud, their massive bodies radiating heat. Goats were trickier. If not invited in, they'd find a way on their own, slipping through gaps, climbing over low walls, asserting their place with the kind of stubbornness only goats possess. Chickens took to the rafters or perched on anything high enough to avoid being stepped on, clucking softly in the smoky dark. And pigs, they just flopped wherever they pleased, heavy and indifferent, masters of the warmest part of the floor. But with warmth came chaos. A peasant might lie down for sleep only to be awakened by a chicken hopping onto their chest or a goat trying to chew on a corner of a blanket. And mornings were full of surprises. Stepping into a warm pile of something left behind during the night, finding a chicken roosting in your laundry, waking nose to nose with a curious calf. It wasn't clean, it wasn't pleasant, but it worked, because beyond the inconvenience, beyond the noise and smell, there was the deeper truth. Cold kills, and warmth, even if it came with feathers and fur, was salvation. Every creature in that home, human or animal, was part of a fragile ecosystem of survival. You learned to share space, to forgive the snorts and stomps and midnight bleating, because the alternative was far worse. Even the way peasants dressed reflected this dance with the cold. Fashion was irrelevant. Survival dictated the wardrobe. The rule was simple. If you owned it, you wore it. Sometimes, all at once. First came the rough linen under tunic, thin, scratchy, and rarely clean. Over that, a wool tunic, then another, then a cloak, then a second cloak if you had one. Layer after layer piled on until your silhouette resembled a walking bale of cloth. Children were so bundled they could barely bend their limbs. Shoes were a blessing not everyone could afford. Many simply wrapped their feet in cloth or stuffed them into wooden clogs. Some had patched leather boots, years old and leaking. Rags filled the gaps. Toes turned purple. People hobbled, not from age, but from the bite of frost creeping through soles thin as paper. Washing? Forget it. Washing meant removing those precious layers, dragging your only tunic to a frozen stream, cracking the ice, scrubbing with numbed fingers, then waiting days for the fabric to dry. So they didn't. Clothes stayed on until spring, until the stench became unbearable or lice set up permanent residence. But even that grime had a purpose. It acted as insulation. Dirt and body oils clogged the weave of the cloth, blocking wind and sealing in warmth. Not pleasant, not sanitary, but functional. Peasants knew this. They understood it instinctively, that to strip down was to surrender. Clean clothes were cold clothes. Fresh linen might feel nice for a moment, but it wouldn't keep the cold out like a tunic layered with weeks of sweat and soot. So they embraced the filth. It was armor, a badge of survival, and through it all, they endured. They walked through snow with straw in their shoes, faces wrapped in wool, eyes squinting against the sting of the wind. Children mimicked their parents, waddling like overstuffed turnips. Adults moved slowly, carefully, conserving every bit of energy and heat. There was no elegance in winter, no grace, only the quiet stubbornness of people who refused to let the cold win. They were wrapped in rags, cloaked in smoke, surrounded by livestock and dirt, and yet every morning they stood, stretched, and began again. Because that's what survival demanded. In the heart of those frozen nights, when the fire dimmed and every surface exhaled cold, medieval peasants leaned on rituals, ones born not of superstition, but of sheer necessity. They had learned through countless winters that survival wasn't only about what you wore or how much wood you burned, it was also about where you slept, how you breathed, what you ate before bed, and even how you arranged your family on the floor. Sleep was not guaranteed. It was a fragile thing, and winter had its ways of interrupting it. So families adapted. They didn't all sleep at once. Someone always kept watch. Not in the dramatic sense of guarding against wolves or bandits, though that wasn't impossible. The real threat was much quieter. The fire going out, a gap in the wall letting in a fresh draft, the embers dimming too far to recover. So they slept in shifts. Half the household would rest, wrapped in every available fabric, while the others kept the hearth alive. There was no schedule, no strict rotation. It was informal, but disciplined. One person poked the fire, adjusted the coals, checked on the younger children or the animals pressed up against the walls. When their limbs grew stiff and their eyes too heavy, They nudged someone else awake to take their place. And so the night moved forward, hour by hour, hand by hand. Children, once old enough to hold a stick or stir the coals, were drafted into this quiet war. Grandparents, for all their aching joints, often took the longest shifts, partly because they couldn't lie down easily, and partly because they had the knowledge. They knew how to read the fire, how to whisper it back to life when it faltered. They had seen too many nights, lost too many flames, to trust anyone else completely. When it came time to sleep, positioning was everything. The fire's heat didn't spread evenly. It roasted whoever sat closest, while everyone else slowly froze in a widening ring of cold. So peasants developed a sleeping system. The youngest and oldest, the most vulnerable, slept nearest to the hearth. Their safety wasn't negotiable. Parents and stronger adults fanned out around them, forming a barrier, a wall of warmth. The animals clustered around them in a circle of silent solidarity. Too close to the fire, though, and you risked waking up singed, or worse. More than one wool cloak caught fire in the night. More than one child was dragged back just in time. It was a delicate dance. Stay near the glow, but not within reach of the sparks. Breathing itself became a conscious act. In the bitterest cold, taking deep breaths through the mouth was dangerous. It could chill the lungs, trigger coughing fits, or worse. So peasants learned to breathe shallow and through the nose. Parents scolded children for panting like dogs. Elders demonstrated the slow, quiet rhythm of controlled breathing. Less air, more heat kept in. Even the way they exhaled was strategic. Slow puffs through layers of cloth wrapped across their faces to keep the air warm before it reached the lungs. It wasn't comfort, it was calculated survival. And then there was food. Warmth didn't just come from the outside, it came from within. Peasants learned to eat heavy, fatty meals before sleep. Thick stews made of root vegetables, grains, maybe a bit of salted meat if the household was lucky. The goal was not flavor, it was fuel. Digesting those dense calories kept the body working through the night, creating a small but vital fire in the belly. The food sat like a stone, heating from the inside. It didn't matter if it gave you strange dreams or left you bloated. What mattered was that your hands didn't go numb before sunrise. Parents insisted that even the pickiest child swallow every spoonful. You didn't skip dinner in winter. Hunger made you colder, and colder made you weaker. Weakness didn't last long in a medieval January. Sometimes peasants added small touches to improve the night's odds. A stone, heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth, was placed at the foot of the bed. It wasn't much, but its warmth lingered just long enough to make falling asleep easier. These stones were treated like treasures. Dropping one could mean the loss of the only real comfort you had. Another trick, the hay box. A wooden box lined with hay, used not just for storing food, but for keeping things warm. A pot of porridge or stew, once heated, could be tucked inside, the hay locking in the heat for hours. By night, it became a kind of medieval slow cooker, a small miracle of insulation and forethought. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was taken for granted. Every ember, every rag, every spoonful of broth was part of a greater battle. Winter wasn't a season, it was an enemy, and each night survived was a tiny victory, celebrated in silence, in breath, in the fragile miracle of waking up with all your fingers still attached. They didn't call themselves brave. They didn't think of it as endurance. But it was. It was the quiet, relentless strength of people who had no safety net, no margin for error, and yet refused to disappear. Not when there was still breath to be drawn, still fire to coax from ash. In the coldest depths of winter, where even breath turned brittle and silence froze against the walls, medieval peasants became masters of adaptation. Their homes were not shelters in the way we think of today. They were battlegrounds, every corner tested by wind, every seam questioned by the cold. So they fortified not with stone or steel, but with cloth, moss, dung, and determination. Drafts were relentless. They slipped through the tiniest cracks in the wattle and daub walls, finding the places your hands couldn't reach, the gaps you forgot. And they didn't whisper. They screamed through the boards, tugged at cloaks, rattled wooden shutters with wild glee. There was no moment of calm, no sacred corner untouched, but people fought back with what they had. They stuffed the holes with anything soft, old rags, sheep's wool, moss pulled from damp rocks, tufts of animal hair, even the remnants of clothing too worn to repair. Nothing was thrown away in winter. If it could be packed into a wall, tied over a crack, or nailed across a doorway, it was used. If that still didn't stop the chill, they went outside, shivering and muttering, and smeared a fresh coat of mud mixed with straw and dung over the walls. This ritual became a kind of grim tradition, a renewal of the house's armor before the worst storms. Slapping freezing handfuls of manure on the outside wall while your fingers ached from the cold may not have felt like progress, but it worked. For a time, the roof leaked. Of course it did. It was made of thatch, bundles of straw tied tightly and layered thickly, but never perfectly. Rain and snow pushed through over time, seeping in slowly at first, then in sudden bursts. Water dripped onto beds, into bowls, onto foreheads. Patches were added. More straw, old fabric, even stolen clumps of sod laid across the gaps like an offering to the sky. Over time, the ceiling became a patchwork quilt of desperation. You could trace the history of winters past by the repairs. This spot where the snow collapsed the beams, that place where the rain pooled and soaked the sleeping mat for days. Windows weren't real windows. A small square hole in the wall, covered by a stretched animal skin or thick cloth soaked in fat, might allow a sliver of daylight or a waft of air. But in winter, even that was a risk. Most stayed shut tight, sealed with layers of fabric and prayer. Letting in light also let in death. Doors were laughable, just thick planks of wood held together by nails and stubborn hope, often warped by years of dampness. Wind pushed them open when it pleased. Snow crept under them, they swelled and shrank with the weather. People placed rocks or old sacks against them at night, not for security, but for insulation. Every evening the home became a fortress, not of strength, but of creativity. Before sleep, someone always checked the walls. Someone made the rounds, pressing hands to corners, feeling for unexpected cold. It was like searching for leaks in a ship, because in many ways, that's what the home was. A ship adrift in a sea of ice and wind, its timbers groaning, its sails in tatters, but its crew determined to see land again. And in the midst of all this, there was still the fire. The hearth was more than warmth. It was memory. It was ritual. It was control in a world where so little could be controlled. The fire was light when the sun vanished at 4 o'clock. It was the scent of porridge, of roasted onions, of burning peat. It was the center of every story told, every prayer whispered, every silence shared. It was the difference between survival and surrender. But even fire needed tending. Even fire could betray you. Let it go out, and you had more than just cold to worry about. Reigniting the flame in the early hours of morning, with numb hands and wet wood, was an ordeal no one wanted. That's why they watched it so carefully. That's why they slept beside it, moved their beds close to the orange glow, even if the smoke choked them in their sleep. And so they patched and packed and layered their world. They clung to each other, wrapped in filth and smoke and frost, not because it was comfortable, but because it was the only way to live. And in that shared discomfort, in that unspoken agreement to keep each other warm, something powerful grew. Not luxury, not peace, but resilience. They learned to live not in spite of winter, but with it. They outwitted it, outlasted it, even laughed at it when they could. If a chicken sat on your head in the night, well, at least your scalp stayed warm. If your cloak reeked of smoke and goat, better that than freezing in your sleep. If you had to sleep 3 deep, tangled with siblings and grandparents and the family dog, you didn't complain. You were grateful. Because the cold came for everyone. But not everyone let it win. Among the many survival tactics medieval peasants passed down like heirlooms, one was as quiet as it was essential: how to breathe. It seems strange at first. Breathing is involuntary, thoughtless, but in a world where winter air could pierce your lungs like a blade, even breathing had to become a skill. Open-mouth breathing pulled the cold straight into your chest. The icy air could burn as it entered, triggering a harsh cough, a sharp wheeze, or worse. In an age without doctors nearby, without medicine beyond the herbal poultice and whispered prayer, catching a chill was not just an inconvenience, it was a threat. Pneumonia was a killer, swift and silent. Many who coughed in December were gone by January. So peasants trained themselves to breathe gently, shallowly, and only through the nose. The narrow nasal passage warmed the air before it reached the lungs. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. They learned to slow their breath, to keep it close, to ration it like they would food or firewood. Some took it a step further. They wrapped their faces at night, not just to guard against drafts, but to create a small pocket of warm air to breathe into and out of. Cloaks were pulled up to the nose. Scarves, if they had them, were knotted tight. Even strips of cloth or wool scraps were repurposed as breath masks. Come morning, these would be damp with condensation, frozen around the edges, clinging like frost-bitten leaves. But still, they had done their job. Children were taught this early. Slow your breath, their parents said. Through the nose. Keep it small. It became habit, almost a meditation. A strange, subconscious rhythm that settled into them for life. Breathing was no longer automatic. It was deliberate, and it was sacred. But cold air attacked from more than just the lungs. It pressed into bellies, into bones, into dreams. So food became another weapon. The evening meal wasn't merely a matter of hunger. It was fuel for the night's battle. Calories meant warmth. A full belly burned like a small furnace, spreading heat from the core outwards, feeding the fire inside that the world tried so hard to extinguish. Stews were common. Thick, brown, unappealing to look at, but heavy in all the right ways. Turnips, onions, parsnips, whatever root vegetables were still edible after months of storage. Grains thickened the broth. Oats, barley, rye. If there was meat, it was salted pork, a sliver of fat clinging to the bone, or a scrap of dried sausage from some holiday feast long past. Sometimes it was just bread dunked in broth, heavy and chewy, designed more to fill than to please. These meals weren't meant for joy, they were meant for endurance. A hot, heavy meal could keep a child warm until sunrise. It could keep a grandmother from shivering herself awake every hour. It could give a man the strength to get up before dawn, feed the animals, and restart the fire without his hands going numb. Even fat was prized, not just because it kept the food rich, but because it burned slowly in the body. It gave lasting warmth, a slow release of energy that helped fight off the creeping cold. Some families saved lard like gold, adding spoonfuls to soup or spreading it on dark bread. To the modern tongue, it would seem unpleasant. But to a peasant facing the wolf-like bite of midwinter, it was precious. And still, there were clever touches. Stones heated in the fire were wrapped in cloth and tucked into beds. The warmth wouldn't last the whole night, but it offered a window, a few blessed hours where toes weren't numb and backs weren't clenched. These stones, if dropped, could break a toe or start a fire. But wrapped right, placed carefully, they became something close to a miracle. Food, breath, warmth. It was all a system, a choreography learned by watching, by failing, by surviving. You didn't just eat. You ate with purpose. You didn't just breathe. You managed your breath like a flickering candle. You didn't just sleep. You fought your way through the night, and if you woke with all your fingers and toes still warm, you counted it as a victory. There were no guides, no books, just memory, just routine, just the unspoken knowledge passed from one generation to the next. This is how we survive. This is how we keep the cold from taking us. And in that knowledge, handed down like a song with no beginning and no end, was the soul of a people who lived not because they had comfort, but because they refused to let the cold define them. Long before the idea of modern convenience was born, before heating coils, thermostats, or even the humble matchstick, peasants had their own arsenal of quiet inventions to survive winter's relentless siege. These tools were not made of polished metal or clever clockwork.
They were born from dirt, fire, and observation. Among them, two stood out for their brilliance in simplicity: the haybox and the heated stone. The haybox, at first glance, appeared to be nothing more than a wooden chest filled with straw. But in reality, it was an early masterpiece of thermal engineering. When stew or porridge had been brought to a rolling boil over the fire, the pot would be removed, carefully, and tucked deep into this insulated nest of hay. The straw acted like a thermal blanket, holding the heat close, letting the food cook slowly over hours, long after the fire itself had gone cold. There was no waste of wood or peat, no need to relight the fire just to warm up a late-night meal. It was a slow cooker long before electricity was ever imagined. But food wasn't the only thing peasants tucked into hay for warmth. They had another trick: the heated stone. Before bedtime, someone, usually the child who couldn't argue quickly enough, would be sent to the hearth to fish out a flat rock that had been sitting close to the flames all evening. The stone, now glowing with stored heat, would be carefully extracted with tongs or a stick, wrapped in layers of cloth, sometimes even placed in a clay pot and carried to the sleeping area. There it would be tucked beneath bedding or placed near feet or hidden inside straw mattresses. Its heat wouldn't last till dawn, but it would soften the initial chill, lull a body toward sleep, and push back the worst of the night's frost. These rituals became habits, part of the rhythm of winter. You didn't ask why. You simply knew: heat the stone, pack the haybox, cover the coals, hold your breath low and warm. Each act a thread in the fragile tapestry of survival. But even with all this effort, warmth was never a guarantee. The cold pressed in from every direction, so families returned again and again to their oldest ally, each other. At night, the hearth didn't just warm bodies. It decided where those bodies would lie. The sleeping arrangements in a peasant home weren't based on comfort or hierarchy. They were based on need. The sick, the elderly, the youngest, they were placed closest to the fire. Their lives, quite literally, depended on it. Around them, the stronger ones formed layers, like rings around a coal, each person sharing their heat outward while drawing in warmth from the center. Too close to the fire, and you risked a scorched blanket or a singed foot. Too far, and you might as well be lying in a snowbank. It was a delicate balance. People spent nights half warm, half frozen, one side of the body toasty, the other side stiff with frost. You learned to rotate in your sleep, like a roasting bird on a spit, to keep both sides alive. Even the animals weren't left out. Dogs curled into the gaps between family members, chickens settled near the stones, goats and pigs claimed warm corners with indifference. They were not pets, they were part of the heating system, and no one minded. But the fire, for all its power, was selfish. Its warmth didn't stretch far. If you were too far from the hearth, you were on the edge of the circle, where cold crept in like a thief and stole whatever comfort it could. Arguments broke out over inches. A few steps away could be the difference between waking sore and waking shivering. And so, the fire remained the beating heart of the home, not just a physical thing, but a symbol. A reminder that no matter how harsh the wind, no matter how long the night, there was something bright, something warm, something alive holding the darkness at bay. Every night the fire flickered. And every morning it was coaxed back to life, not just because breakfast needed cooking, but because it was the only thing separating the living from the lost. And through it all, the peasants never stopped tending it. If you asked a medieval peasant what the phrase "the more the merrier" meant, they wouldn't think of feasts or dances. They'd picture a huddled mass of humanity bundled together in the darkest corner of a freezing home, limbs tangled, breath mingling, all bound by the same silent hope: to wake up alive. In winter, warmth wasn't individual, it was communal. And privacy, that was a myth no one could afford. Families didn't sleep spread apart. They slept as one, pressed close, curled in, forming a living patchwork of warmth and necessity. On the worst nights, even neighbors might squeeze into the same space. Add a few animals into the mix, and what you got was something between a gathering and a survival cell. You could call it crowded. You could call it chaotic. But more than anything, it was practical. Children were packed into the middle, small bodies acting as kindling between layers of flesh and fabric. The elderly, frail and brittle from age and cold, were cushioned in the heart of the pile. Around them, the sturdier family members arranged themselves like bricks around a fire, anchoring, absorbing, shielding. Some even had a strategy for this. The strongest slept on the outside edge, acting as barriers against the freezing air. They bore the brunt of the drafts, the shifting of wind through the wall cracks, the icy touch of stone and earth. If their skin stiffened or their fingers numbed, they didn't complain. Their warmth protected the center. And yet, for all the strategy, the nights weren't quiet. Someone always snored. Someone always shifted too far and exposed another to the chill. One wrong movement could yank a blanket out of place or push a sibling against the damp, frozen wall. A single elbow in the wrong spot might earn a sharp hiss or a muttered curse. The peace was thin, but precious. Bedding, such as it was shared. A single straw mattress might support a dozen people, pressed so tightly together they could feel each other's heartbeat. The straw flattened fast. It molded to the shape of those who slept on it, creating grooves and dips like old tree roots. Sometimes, the bedding started to move on its own, not from people, but from the bugs who made their homes in it. Fleas, lice, other nameless things. They were simply part of the arrangement, but none of that mattered as much as staying warm. Dignity, space, scent, all could be sacrificed if it meant one more hour of uninterrupted sleep. And with the discomfort came something unexpected: connection. Families who spent winter nights wrapped together in cloth and desperation grew close in ways modern people might never understand. They told stories under the blankets. They sang softly, shared memories, planned planting seasons, or whispered secrets while the fire crackled beside them. In those hours, they weren't just surviving. They were weaving bonds, reinforcing trust, becoming something more than individuals. Sometimes, even livestock joined the pile. A goat might squeeze into a gap between two siblings. A dog might press against a father's chest. Chickens might roost on rafters above, their soft sounds becoming part of the night's rhythm. There was no line between human and animal warmth. Everyone contributed. Everyone endured. And in the dark, when the wind howled and the snow tapped on the roof like bony fingers, the world outside shrank. All that remained was the firelight, the soft breathing, the warmth of others pressed close. No one talked of dreams. Dreams were for spring. The goal was simpler: make it to morning. And more often than not, they did. Not because of luck and not because the cold relented, but because they faced it together. As families, as neighbors, as clusters of warmth in a world built to freeze them out. To modern ears, it might sound absurd. But in the depths of medieval winter, the best heating system in a peasant's home often had 4 legs, hooves, feathers, or a snout. Livestock weren't just animals, they were heaters, companions, even early warning systems. When the cold was cruel and relentless, animals weren't kept outside. They were invited in. This wasn't sentimentality, it was math. Every living body radiated heat, and in a house with no insulation, no fireplace beyond a smoky hearth, and no real doors or windows, every degree of warmth counted. The line between barn and bedroom blurred, not because peasants didn't understand boundaries, but because survival didn't care about boundaries. Chickens nestled in dark corners, occasionally clucking in their sleep. Pigs snorted and stretched out beside the hearth like they paid rent. Goats wandered freely, chewing on anything left unattended. Cows leaned against walls, their massive sides steaming gently in the firelight. It was chaotic, noisy, and absolutely necessary. The arrangement wasn't glamorous, far from it. Imagine a room already crowded with sleeping humans, now peppered with restless animals. The air was thick, smoke, sweat, damp straw, and the unmistakable perfume of livestock mingling into a single, overwhelming scent. You learned to breathe through your mouth, or not at all, but that smell came with comfort. A cow in the room meant fewer frozen toes in the morning. A pig snoring nearby meant your children would be warmer through the night. Every snort, every grunt, every cluck was a sign of shared life, of shared heat. And if the price was stepping into something unpleasant on your way to the fire, well, so be it. Animals weren't just tolerated, they were strategically positioned. Cows, large and warm, were placed closest to the center of the home. Goats, tricky and agile, often claimed spots nearer to people, especially since they had a habit of sneaking in regardless. Chickens preferred the rafters or baskets hung from beams, but they'd often flap down without warning. Pigs, blessed with complete indifference to social norms, simply collapsed wherever they pleased, often in the most inconvenient locations possible. This arrangement wasn't without its hazards. You could be awakened by a goat chewing on your hair. A chicken might decide your chest was the perfect roost. A cow might shift in its sleep and knock over a pot or a piece of burning wood. The risks were real but accepted. You didn't argue with a warm body in a freezing house. And there was something else, something quiet and profound. These animals weren't just warmth, they were safety. A house full of livestock was less likely to be targeted by thieves. A neighbor might think twice before sneaking into your field to take your last goat if that goat was curled beside your daughter near the hearth. Of course, there was always tension. Sharing a home with livestock meant accidents. It meant damage. It meant disease sometimes spread faster. But in winter, you weighed every choice against one thing, the cold. And by that measure, a home full of animals was a fortress. Even the youngest children understood this. They didn't question why the cow was in the room. They patted its side like a sibling, whispered to it before sleep, and pressed their cold feet against its warmth without shame. It was normal. It was necessary. It was how people lived. And when spring finally arrived, when the doors could open again, when the animals could return to the fields, and the straw could be thrown out and replaced, there was relief, yes, but also a strange emptiness. The warmth that had saved them now wandered outside on hooves and paws and cloven feet, but they had made it, together. In the medieval world, clothing was not a matter of appearance. It was armor, not against war but against the cold. No one worried about fashion during winter. The only rule was simple and absolute. If you had it, you wore it. And if you didn't, you suffered. The first layer was usually a linen undertunic, rough and scratchy, likely stained by years of wear. Over that, a wool tunic, thicker, heavier, often patched so many times it resembled a mosaic of mismatched fabric. If you had another, you wore it too. Cloaks were thrown over shoulders, held together with string, bone pins, or sheer will. And if you were one of the lucky few to own a sheepskin, full, shaggy, and half-rotted, you wore that proudly, regardless of the smell. Peasants looked bulky, not from abundance but from necessity. They layered until they resembled bundles of laundry come to life. Movement became stiff. Arms didn't bend easily. Knees barely flexed, but no one complained. Warmth was worth every awkward stride. Gloves and hats were treasures. A simple wool cap could mean the difference between sleep and frostbite. Mittens were sewn from scraps of cloth or leather, often so crude they barely stayed on. Children waddled around swaddled in layers, arms sticking out at odd angles, faces nearly lost beneath fabric and grime. They looked absurd, but they stayed alive. Shoes were rare luxuries, boots rarer still. Most peasants wrapped their feet in rags or old cloth and stuffed them into wooden clogs. Sometimes they had nothing but the cloth. As the cold bled through the gaps, more layers were added. And still, frostbitten toes were a reality. Some simply disappeared over time, numbed, blackened, forgotten. A price of survival. Washing clothes during winter was nearly unthinkable. It meant stripping away warmth, hauling stiff fabric to a frozen stream, breaking through ice, scrubbing until your fingers burned. Then waiting, sometimes days, for them to dry, if they didn't just freeze solid in the process. Most chose the easier path. Don't wash at all. Smelling like a barn was preferable to freezing. And oddly enough, this neglect had benefits. The buildup of grease, sweat, and soot created a grimy insulation. The dirt filled the gaps between fibers, sealing out wind. It acted like a medieval Gore-Tex, holding body heat in, keeping drafts out. Yes, it was disgusting, but it worked. In winter, dirt was more than a byproduct of life, it was protection. They didn't see it as slovenliness. They saw it as wisdom. A cleaned cloak was a cold cloak. A fresh tunic was a risk. Better to wear your grime like a badge, layered and layered until it formed its own second skin. Even under all this, the body found ways to suffer. The wind found your wrists. The snow seeped into your boots. The sleeves frayed. The seams burst. And still you patched, sewed, stuffed straw into holes, tied rope around gaps. Every garment was an evolving creation, shaped by time and need and bitter experience. What they wore was not pretty. It was not elegant, but it told a story of lives lived on the edge of exposure, of people who had no choice but to keep moving, keep wrapping, keep breathing through cloth and filth. When you looked at a peasant in winter, you weren't seeing poverty. You were seeing resilience. In a world without insulation, hot water, or even the hope of a warm breeze, medieval peasants discovered that filth, yes, actual filth, could be a tool. A weapon against the cold. Not something to scrub away, but something to cultivate carefully and strategically. At first, the dirt clung to them by accident. You labored in the fields, slept on straw, sat by a smoky fire, and bathed maybe twice a year. The grime built up without permission. But over time, they realized something. That grime trapped heat. Layers of old sweat, oil, soot, and dust filled the pores of their clothing and skin. It stopped the wind from cutting through fabric. It insulated. Freshly washed linen was a hazard in winter. Light, breathable, and clean. That meant it let in the cold. A tunic fresh from the stream was a curse, not a comfort. The fibers had too much space between them, too much room for the cold to settle in. But that same tunic, unwashed for weeks, stiff with grease and wood smoke, would trap your body heat like a cocoon. Peasants didn't need science to explain it. They had experience. So they stopped washing in the cold months. Bathing became a memory reserved for spring and summer. Clothes were worn day and night, slept in, worked in, eaten in, cried in. Dirt became a second skin, and over time it took on a certain sacredness. The filth was not filth. It was function. Of course, it came with drawbacks. Fleas and lice loved the layers. The smell was something between a smokehouse and a compost heap, but no one noticed. When everyone smelled the same, no one stood out. And with the bitter wind biting at the corners of the house, your nose had more pressing things to complain about. Changing clothes wasn't really part of the daily routine either. You wore your inner layers until they became unwearable. And then instead of washing, you simply added another tunic on top. A second cloak. A pair of leggings tied over the first. Eventually, you wore your entire wardrobe. The longer winter lasted, the bulkier you became. By February, most peasants resembled walking bundles of cloth and history. Their clothing bore the marks of every meal spilled, every night survived, every hour spent beside the hearth. Each stain told a story, this one from the turnip soup, that one from the time you slipped on the frozen path and landed hard. They weren't ashamed of it. They were proud. To outside eyes, they might have looked like they'd given up. But that wasn't true. They had simply adapted. In a season where water froze in your cup and wind slipped through walls like a ghost, you did what worked. And what worked was grime. Even soap, when it existed, was tucked away like treasure. Made from animal fat and ash, it was harsh, precious, and used sparingly. Maybe if a priest was visiting. Maybe if someone was dying and deserved to go out clean. But most of the time it sat unused. Cleanliness was a risk. A naked body, wet and exposed, was a death sentence. Peasants taught their children early. Don't bathe unless you have to. Don't strip down in winter. Don't mock the smell. That stink might save your life. So they layered, they crusted, they endured. And when spring finally broke winter's grip and the sun thawed the ground, the first full bath was as much a ceremony as it was a necessity. But until then, they wrapped themselves in wool, in smoke, in filth, and in the stubborn pride of having made it one more day. Because in that world, dirt wasn't shame. Dirt was survival.